All right, good afternoon. I'm going to go ahead and get started. So this review is on personality, and it's good if you're here because we've only covered this once so far, since this was in the fourth quarter material. All right, so let's start off with the definition. So your personality is basically your character. It's how people describe you. So adjectives that people use to describe you. Are you shy? Are you outgoing? Are you very stressed? So it's our characteristic patterns of thinking, feeling, and acting. I apologize for my coffee brewing in the background. There are 4 different perspectives on how our personality is actually formed. Psychoanalysis, humanistic, trait, and social cognitive. The majority of the questions on the test will come from the psychoanalytic perspective. And that's good because you should know that perspective pretty well. So the psychoanalytic perspective was coined by Sigmund Freud. And again, he believed that the reason why we act the way we do and we think the way we do, according to this perspective, is because it's due to unconscious thoughts or early childhood experiences that we've had. So our personality stems from unconscious thoughts and childhood experiences as well. All right, so according to Freud, we have 3 different components to our personality: the id, the ego, and the superego. So the id is the part of your personality that you're born with. Okay, this is the pleasure principle. So on the test, you'll usually see pleasure principle associated with the id. So this is like the selfish baby in us all, who insists on having immediate gratification. They want their needs met immediately. Otherwise, they're going to start crying. They don't understand that they have to wait for things. You're riding down the road and your child is hungry. They're going to cry. They don't understand that you're stuck in traffic. You cannot feed them at that time. So that is the id. It's our pleasure seeking, the little devil on our shoulder. The superego, this is the opposite. This is our conscience. This is our morals, our sense of what's right and what's wrong. So the superego is always in conflict with the id. They want everything to be appropriate. Identification just simply means that we get our morals and our values from our caregivers. That is something we talked about when we looked at nature nurture. It's not something you're born with. We tend to adapt to the morals and values that from the caregivers that we're raised by. All right, then the third part of the personality is the ego, and always associate reality, or this is a compromiser. The ego wants to satisfy the id. It'd be terrible if you went through life and you never really had the things that you want. You never had any pleasure. But it does so in an acceptable manner to satisfy the superego. So it's the mediator between the two. It compromises. All right, so id, ego, and superego. All right, Freud also believed that our personality is shaped by going through what he called psychosexual stages. So we have certain sexual conflicts at different stages, and he referred to this as our libido. So our personality is formed as we transition through these different psychosexual stages. At each stage, there's a conflict, which he calls a fixation. And if that isn't resolved, then we can have issues in our personality later in life. It can interfere with our ability to function appropriately. So there'll be some character flaw, if you will. All right, so let's look at the different stages. The first stage Freud calls the oral stage. And if you think about what's a baby doing for the first year, year and a half, they're focused on the mouth, sucking, biting, chewing. Everything you hand them, they put in their mouth. You have to be very careful. So that's where the pleasure comes in. So let me see if I have the fixation. No, I don't. All right. So if a child is not allowed to be fed, when they're hungry, it may be delayed. If they're not allowed to bite on things or suck their fingers or suck a binky, that can cause issues later in life, according to this perspective. So later in life, Freud said the fixation would be an oral fixation. So they would have some fixation involving the mouth. So maybe overeating, being sarcastic, or sucking their thumb, smoking, biting their nails, something wrong with the mouth due to that lack of the oral stimulation. Right, the second stage during the toddler years, this would be the anal stage, and it's called anal stage because children are learning to control their bowels and bladder. Okay, so they're learning to go to the bathroom on their own. They're starting to become more independent, starting to make choices on their own as well. So there's two fixations that can happen here. First of all, an anal fixation. So if a child is pushed too early, you're going to sit there. Here's a book. You're going to sit there and you're going to go potty and don't get up until you do. So they're kind of pushed and scolded, maybe if they have an accident. So parents are overbearing. That can cause an anal fixation later in life. And that person might be very, very neat and orderly and very rigid and not be able to really relax. Everything has to have its place. The opposite, if a child is not encouraged to go to the bathroom, they're just whenever, they'll go whenever they want. The opposite will happen. An anal expulsive personality they would have later in life. They'd be very messy and disorganized. All right, the third, this is from 3 to 6. So these are your preschool years. This is the phallic stage. So the focus here is on the genitals. They're starting to learn about their genitals and recognizing that little girls are different from little boys. This may happen, at home or at daycare or whatever. They start to recognize their own sex is different than the others. Now, the conflict here, according to Freud, is they have incestuous sexual feelings. So that would mean they have sexual desires for the opposite sex parent. Okay, well, children at this age do not understand sex like we know what sex is. So in other words, Freud was saying that children crave the attention of the opposite sex parent and have like a rivalry with the same sex parent. So this is called, for the boys, the Oedipus complex. So they have feelings of jealousy and rivalry for their father, and they're trying to gain that attention. I know Freud writes sexual desires, but again, it's craving the attention. They don't know what sex is at 3 and 4 years old. So the Electra complex or crisis would be for the girls. It's the girls' desire to gain their father's attention and have that rivalry with the mother. But that usually goes back to transitioning to wanting to be with the same sex parent by the time they're 6 and go into the next stage. So the next stage, this is the elementary school years. This would be latency. So this is when there really isn't a conflict. Sexual feelings lie dormant, non-existent. And during this time period, it's like a training ground for individuals reacting and interacting with same-sex peers. Little girls want to hang out with little girls in elementary school, and little boys power around with little boys. And if you go to a playground, that's very obvious. The boys think the girls have cooties, the girls are doing one thing, the boys are doing another. And again, that's training ground for when you become an adult and interact with your same-sex peers. The last stage when you reach puberty is the genital stage. And this is when we understand what sex is, like you and I know, and you develop sexual interests in another individual. And this is from puberty on. And there really isn't a fixation here, according to Freud. Freud is Freud. So he said if you're fixated on sex, it would be a good thing. All right. So the next thing we looked at with psychoanalysis would be defense mechanisms. So these are things that our mind does unconsciously to help us deal with something that's painful or causing us anxiety. I believe there's 7. All right. So if something painful happens to you, the first one is repression. So if someone breaks up with you, you just completely forget who they were and that you were ever even going out with them. You banish all thoughts. If you were bullied as a child, you forget all about that. Every memory goes away of it. Controversial, some people think it can happen. Others say, no, it can't. Regression. So with regression, if something upsetting happens to you, you start doing things you did when you were a child, maybe sleeping with your stuffed animal, sucking your thumb. The question on the AP test is usually a young boy, he's 8, and his parents are going to have a baby, and he's upset because he's been the only child for so long, so he starts wetting the bed again. Reaction formation, this is doing the opposite of what we actually feel. So let's say my boss yells at me for something, scolds me. So instead of reacting, angrily, I say, oh, I really like my boss. He's the best boss ever. So you're doing the opposite of what you actually feel. So maybe a young mother is the common question. A young mother gets pregnant unexpectedly and she's upset about it. But she starts treating the child very, very protective, because she's doing the opposite of what she actually felt. Projection. So this is casting your own thoughts onto others to help you deal with some painful situation. So let's say if someone breaks up with you, you're really upset. So you start to think to yourself, well, they still like me. So that helps you deal with it. Rationalization. So if something terrible happens to you, you start justifying it by saying you're better off. So if someone breaks up with you, you say, they were bad for me. I'm way better off. I'll find someone way better. So you're justifying that pain. Displacement. So if something upsetting happens to you, you take your frustration or your aggression out on something less threatening. Okay, so if my boss yells at me, I can, instead of yelling back at him and losing my job, I might be angry to my students or go home and yell at my family. So you're displacing towards something less threatening. Denial. So similar to repression. With repression, if something bad happens, you forget everything about it. With denial, you just refuse to admit that painful thing happened. So if someone breaks up with you with regression, you'll forget all about them and who they were and you were dating. With denial, you'll just pretend like that they never broke up with you. You'll just continue to call the person, show up by their locker, go to their house as if it never happened. All right, subliminal. Subliminal, this is channeling your frustration towards a healthier goal. So something upsetting happened to you, and as a result, you do something positive. You might take a class in the evening, join a gym, be a volunteer, something good in place of that anxiety. All right, ways that we assess the unconscious. First of all, we've talked about this multiple times, free association. So someone says whatever comes to mind and the therapist writes it all down and then reiterates back and kind of analyzes them and tells them what's unconsciously going on, what's causing the behavior and the conflict that they're dealing with. We also looked at 2 different projective tests to assess the unconscious. The first one was the TAT test, thematic apperception test, where you look at a story, you look at a picture, you make up a story, the therapist writes that down, similar to free association, and then analyzes you. And so they're looking for positive things, but a lot of the pictures that they show you are very difficult, if you look at that, to find something positive to say. This poor little boy looks like he's sitting there all by himself. They're going to analyze you based on your answers. So you don't want to say like negative things, but this would be hard not to find something negative. And that's the one we did in class together. All right, similar to that, the Rorschach test, Herman Rorschach came up with the ink blot test. So there's 10 different ink blots that you look at and you just say what you think. Again, you're going to want to say like positive things like, bats or birds here. To me, that looks like a man on a motorcycle with his boots. But you don't ever want to say monsters or faces or anything dark. So they're going to assess what's going on with your personality type and any issues you might have based on your answers to these pictures. That would be hard not to see a face, but they think a face indicates paranoia. Right, problems with all of those tests, they're inconsistent. They do have their little checklist that they're looking for. But what if you say something that's completely off the wall? Like that looks like a refrigerator. Well, that's not on their list. So now you're going to be assessed by a person, and you may get one answer from one therapist and go to another therapist and give the same answer and get a completely different analysis. So they're very, very subjective. 3 Neo-Freudians that kind of built or kind of revised. They all believed in the unconscious, but had a little bit of discrepancy with Freud. First of all, Alfred Adler, he said we should focus on social stages instead of sexual stages. And he also believed that birth order played a role in how our personality is shaped. Karen Horney, she pretty much argued against Freud's masculine biases with penis envy. Freud believed that women envy men because of their penis, and she argued against that and said that men actually envy women because we can have babies, and she called that womb envy. Carl Jung, he believed that we all have a collective unconscious, that we all have worldwide certain unconscious ideas about certain things, such as what a hero is or what a villain is. Right, so that's the psychoanalysis perspective. That's the longest one. So the humanistic perspective, again, Rogers and Maslow. Maslow believed our personality is shaped by trying to achieve that highest potential, that self-actualization, and our self-image actually will influence our personality. So how we feel about ourselves. If we don't like ourselves, we're not going to be as confident and independent and outgoing, etc. So poor self-image can harm our personality. Carl Rogers, he believed in also improving self-image, but self-esteem. But in order to do that, individuals needed to focus on these 3 things. One being genuine. So say exactly what you mean. Don't say things that you don't believe to be true. Don't give people compliments just to be nice. If you don't think that, be genuine. Accept yourself and others, without judgment and ridicule. That's difficult to do. We're very critical. And be able to put yourself in other people's place. Show empathy. So if you can focus on these 3 things and improve them, then you will get that total acceptance, which he called unconditional positive regard. And that will help you improve your self-esteem, how you feel about yourself, your self-worth. 2 other terms, spotlight effect. This can impact our self-esteem. We often think that everybody's watching us and judging us and evaluating our appearance, performance, and things like that. And we tend to do that. You see people talking over in the corner and immediately you're like, oh, they're talking about me. And that can bring our self-esteem down. Self-serving bias. This is the fact that we tend to see ourselves as favorable. We don't recognize some of our flaws and deal with them to help with our self-esteem. All right, the third perspective, the trait perspective. This was created by Allport. And the trait perspective just simply says that you're born with your personality. And we classify them in terms of traits. So in order to determine your personality, you take a personality inventory test. And based on your answers to these tests, which are basically agree, disagree if applies to you or if it doesn't. And based on these tests, they tell you what type of personality you have. So the ICNIC personality test, you would take this survey, this questionnaire, and based on your answers, they put you in one of these 4 quadrants. Unstable, which would be, neurotic, I guess, and extroverted. So extroverted is outgoing. So you're unstable, you're touchy, you're aggressive, excitable, you're really open, optimistic. This would be unstable and shy. These would be characteristics that you would possess. Introverted and stable. We have to be on this end. And extroverted, outgoing, and stable. So it would give you one of those 4. Another one that I gave you the web address in class if you wanted to take this, the Big 5. This is usually a test question. They ask you which of the following is not one of the Big 5. So emotional stability, it's usually referred to as neurotic. So neurotic. Extroversion, how outgoing you are, openness, being open to new ideas, agreeableness, being trusting and helpful, conscientiousness, being disciplined and organized. So they spell ocean or canoe. Hopefully that will help. And that was the test website. This is the MMP, and now it's 2. We're in the 2nd edition. So MMP 2. This is a personality test, but it also identifies emotional and psychological disorders. This is the most current or common personality test that's used today. Another biological theory, since we're looking at trait, was the somatotype. William Sheldon believed that your body type actually influences your personality. People who are overweight tend to be friendly and outgoing. Muscular people tend to be more aggressive, and very thin people tend to be more secretive. Again, as I said here, it's never been replicated. All right, the social cognitive perspective. This was Albert Bandura. He believed that our assessment of a situation will influence how we act in it. Our personality is always changing. So how we think about a situation will cause us to react. If you see a person in class and they never talk to anybody, you assume that they're shy or they think they're too good and won't talk to anybody. So you give them the cold shoulder as a result of that. So how you feel about the situation and you think about the situation will cause you to react a certain way. And this is reciprocal determinism. If you are nice to people, they will most likely be nice back. If you're uptight and you're angry, you're going to cause everyone around you to be tense. So we pretty much create our own environment. We determine how others will reciprocate to us. All right. The last thing we need to look at is the locus of control. External locus of control means that our fate is not in our own hands. Other people are controlling our fate. And internal locus of control is the fact that we think we have control over our own lives. All right. So that is everything with personality. If you have any questions, please let me know. I recommend you go and do some of the questions for this chapter in your practice book. And let me know. I'll be here for about a half an hour. Message me if you have any questions. All right. Thank you. Have a good day, and I'll see y'all tomorrow.